so much for joining us this Sunday evening for Science Gallery Bengaluru's Psyche Public Lecture Series. For those of you who are here for the first time, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a new institution for public engagement with research. Psyche is our fifth exhibition season and the third one that is completely online. So over the 45 days, Psyche has been unpacking the complexities of the human mind. Today, as a part of our lecture series, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Sanjeev Jain, who will be delivering a lecture titled Hysteria, the Complex and Convoluted Persistence of an Idea. Dr. Jain is many things, but he has been a staunch supporter and collaborator for Science Gallery Bengaluru, and he is also the academic advisor for this exhibition season. He's also been one of our contributing artists and together with Dr. Alok Sarin and Pratima Murthy is responsible for the exhibit, The Asylum, which is there in the exhibition. So please do check that out. A little more about Dr. Jain. Sanjeev teaches at the Department of Psychiatry at NIMHANS, that's the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurological Sciences. There, in addition to being a clinician, he researches the genetic and genomic correlates of psychiatric and neurological diseases using both genetic analysis and model systems. He has an abiding interest in studying the symptoms and outcomes of psychosis, as well as the social and biological correlates. He has also studied historical and social responses to mental health issues, including the development of psychiatric care, medical sciences, and health policy in South Asia from the colonial and post-colonial time periods. Before I hand over to Sanjeev to talk about Hysteria, I'd also like to tell you a bit more about some of the programs coming up next weekend. Do join us for a very interesting program with the Lincoln Center, which talks about music supports memory. This talks about Lincoln Center's performances for adults with dementia. So this is an event by artists and performers from the Lincoln Center on the 5th of May at 6:30 p.m. India time. And do also join us for a very interesting panel discussion around stem cell research. This is called Thinking in a Dish, Stem Cell Research and the Human Brain. So the panel discussion has researchers Raghu Padanya, Sridhar Venkatapuram, and Sujata Raman. And this is on the 6th of May at 4:30 p.m. I'd also like to remind the audience that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the lecture. So please add all your questions in the Q&A box and Sanjeev will be happy to answer them at the end of the lecture. Also, please do fill out the feedback form. The link is in the chat box. We would love to hear what you think about this program, about the exhibition, and what Science Gallery Bengaluru can do going forward. Now, I'd like to hand over to Sanjeev for the lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, thank you for the introduction, and hope we can fulfill whatever you wanted out of this session. So, let me just share my screen. Thank you. And as mentioned, I'll be talking about hysteria, the complex and convoluted persistence of an idea, for about 35 minutes, and then we'll 35 to 40 minutes. So the idea of hysteria is very old because what it starts out with is the notion of healing itself. Now, the idea that the human body is made of clay or just matter, and it is God who gives it consciousness, who gives it its soul. And therefore, the capacity to influence the soul was the matter of divinity. And miracles which caused the lame to walk, the blind to see, the sleepy to walk, to wake up out of stupor, these are all the miracles that confirmed godliness or saintliness on the early religious figures. Now, this was true of the Greek temple myths, of the Greek gods, of the Indian gods, of almost all of human civilization has had a divine source for giving the notion of the mind. And you can see in these classical paintings of the Renaissance period, the healing of the lame man, the healing of the lame man by Arthur Wolford in 1601, and Anthony van Dyck, Christ healing the paralytic. It is mirrored by the fact that the medicine Buddha is seen as the healer, provider, and protector for both the spiritual and the physical realm. And Buddha himself was quite an accomplished doctor, and as was Nagarjuna, his disciples. So the medical tradition within Buddhism was also quite well developed. So these kinds of ideas about how illness has to be managed, and that's a significant source of suffering, and how to remove suffering was a preoccupation with religious ideas. By the Middle Ages, however, the fact of modern day life in the Middle Ages had become quite uh, difficult to understand. The ideas of the devil, whether it's in Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, were quite pervasive. The ideas that human beings could lead fairly deformed lives, both in their physical appearance and in their mental behavior and in the social behavior, filled with all kinds of imaginary fears and all kinds of imaginary objects. And they were often prone to all kinds of illusions and hallucinations, which were basically the work of Maya, if you want to look at it from the Hindu perspective, but of sin and venery in the Christian perspective, that the devil could take hold of people's souls. There were also epidemics of hysteria. There was a dancing plague in Strasbourg in 1518, where lots of people, one person started dancing, and then everybody started dancing, and they danced till they died. And for a while, the doctors felt that this could be accentuated by providing free music, but ultimately they realized that the music was only adding to the problem, and they stopped them from playing music. It's still debated whether this dancing plague was the effect of a ergot fungus, something like LSD, something like a party drug. But this really caused a huge change in the way madness or this kind of infectious diseases were being portrayed. It was around this time that the words hysteria actually were resurrected from the ancient Greek texts. Hysteria obviously refers to just the uterus, and the hysterikos in Greek medical theory was a sensation of suffocation due to pressure from an ascending uterus on the heart, liver, and lungs. Now, the idea of an ascending uterus is very interesting because this is obviously before the time that Andreas Vesalius and William Harvey started dissecting the body. So the idea that the inside of the body is one huge lump of tissues and the uterus is free to move all over the body there's no reason to disprove it. People didn't know the existence of the diaphragm as such. The respiratory distress is accompanied irregularly by a wide range of symptoms that also appear in different combinations with other sicknesses. And the main sufferers are recently widowed adult women deprived of the sexual intercourse to which they have been accustomed. So the roots of hysteria lay in the unfulfilled uterus. And from this hysterikos Greek theories, the French adjective hystérique and the English counterpart of hysterical were in existence by 1600. But as soon as the so-called secular renaissance occurred, in which case, by which I mean the dissection of Vesalius and Harvey proved that the body need not need miracles to occur. It was just a collection of tubes and pipes. And there was no reason to assume that there was a supernatural or a cosmic explanation for the running of the body, and therefore also perhaps of the mind. So people like Jordan started objecting to this, that hysteria is not a supernatural disorder, but is due to passions. By passions, they mean, again, the ascending uterus in the physical sense, which causes sympathetic perturbations in the brain of the individual. So the fact that the uterus and the brain are in communication was enunciated by Jordan, and people like Carter, Shane, and Cullen over the next 100-odd years gave the idea that both moral and physical causes could give rise to what we now call hysteria. They assumed, or they predicted, that the causes of hysteria were not in the uterus, but in the brain. And this is, of course, from 5 or 6 years ago, and we'll come to these kinds of discussions a bit later. But between the 16th century to the 21st, you see a direct link between hysteria, hysterectomy, and issues like that. The first opening of this, of the modern concept of hysteria, is a person called Anton Mesmer, after which the word mesmerism is known. Now, Mesmer tried to prove that there are magnetic influences or certain other influences that allow a human mind to communicate with another mind without the need of speech, without the need of action. that there is a kind of sympathetic perturbations that can be caused in other people's brains through these magnetic influences. And Mesmer was a fairly prominent scientist. He tried to put this in terms of electrical waves, and electrical waves had just been discovered in physics. So the idea that electromagnetic influences could influence things at a distance, just like a magnetic field and an electrical field did, was not altogether speculative. People were already familiar with galvanoscopes and electricity by then. What Mesmer extended, however, was that this capacity to influence people could also be transmitted by these, as these paintings show, by the holding of hands. And by this, electrical currents could pass from one to the other, just like they did with conduction, and influence each other's behaviors. They could also be transmitted to inanimate objects, like tables and chairs. And under the effect of mesmerism, people could share their emotions. As you can see, there are people flirting, there are people dancing, there are people doing all kinds of funny things. And this could be affected despite their own propensity to not behave in such a silly manner. So the idea that mesmerism could make people do certain things, which were so-called unconscious, not part of their own reasonable existence, became a popular idea, and mesmeric seances were being conducted all over Paris. He also extended it to the belief that trees could be mesmerized. And if all you needed to get rid of your problems was to go and collect and dance around a tree. Now, these kinds of ideas obviously provoked a whole lot of resentment in the newly discovered scientific academies of France. The French Academy with Benjamin Franklin, Lavoisier, and Billiton had a detailed inquiry about this to see whether this is a valid thing or not. Franklin, as we know, had already worked with electricity in this famous experiment with the kite, and Lavoisier is Lavoisier. And so they said the practice of iron magnetism was a threat not only to health, but also to morality, especially in the case of weak, virtuous women, in whom these influences could give rise to immorality. It also became a article for delusion, so that these machines, people started believing that somehow magnetic influences were being made to insert ideas into their heads, and all kinds of problems were occurring. The problem didn't disappear because the science of the soul became a popular idea even in America, even in the middle of the 19th century. The next step of this occurred again in France, where all these ideas had occurred in the previous 50 years, between two very famous psychiatrists. One is Briquet and the other is Charcot. Charcot is a neurologist, and he's the main character in the film that I had sent a link about. Now, hysteria, according to Briquet, hysteria was a neurosis of the brain by which environmental events acted upon the affective part of the brain. At that point of time, they don't even know what the brain consists of. But in a susceptible and predisposed individual, and it is more likely to occur in females because they are much more likely to be exposed to these unpleasant events. At that time in France, they were not allowed to study, and they were not allowed to enter into any colleges, and all the revolution that was occurring was a male-only revolution, and they were confined to sexual and reproductive roles, which obviously was not appropriate, according to Briquet, to confine human beings into this kind of limited existence. So that age, gender, occupation, family background, social class, education, sexual behavior, prior health, all of these influence the occurrence of hysteria. And he made it a point to report about 50 or 100 men who had hysteria. So obviously there was awareness that this was not simply a women's issue by Briquet. However, Charcot, working in his clinics, the famous Salpêtre clinic, the hospital neurologic, found that certain women could be induced to have fits. During the fits, their bodies were proved to have very elaborate writhing and ecstatic movements of convulsion and contortions, fainting, impairment of consciousness. And this could be remedied by ovarian and pelvic massages. There's a massage either over the iliac fossa on the hip bones or over the center of the body. And this he felt was a disease called hysteroepilepsy, which was exclusively linked to the unfulfilled uterus. Most of these women were young women, 20-year-olds, between 20 and 25, often poorly educated. Some of them had been working as sex workers or were involved in street life of various kinds. So there's a class difference between the two. One of Charcot's students was Freud, and that had a huge impact on Freud's later thinking. But let's jump to the same time in India, which is where we are right now. So these ideas of mesmerism came quite rapidly to India, and James Esdale was a Scottish physician who was working in the civil service in the East India Company's medical service in Bengal. And he reported that mesmerism is the same in India as in Europe. Now, this is a very critical point because by this time, colonialism had occurred. And the idea that the colonies were somehow made of inferior people who needed to be civilized became the guiding lamp of empire. But at least in the early 19th century, the idea of that the Indian population and the European population were exactly the same as far as mesmerism and their subconsciousness was apparent, was a fairly revolutionary idea. So when Esdale says that mesmerism is the same in India as in Europe, he's actually making a startling point as far as people's understanding of psychological equality between different races is concerned. As you can see, the number of cases he treats nervous headaches, pain in the nerves, palsy of one arm of the body or one half of the body. These are typical hysterical symptoms of paralysis of one part of the body. And he also uses it to operate on these tumors, very large tumors, which is 6 feet in circumference, 2.5, some 22 pounds in weight, and he removes it within 3 minutes with the patient perfectly conscious. Anesthesia has not been invented till then. And under the influence of mesmerism, they are able to remove this. So what this points out is that the Western ideas of both neurological and psychological functioning were already apparent in India by this time, by the 1840s. And it was widely accepted by the Rajas and Babus. It was used all over the medical system. But he found, as they've reported, that the local population was peculiarly sensitive as they were simple, unsophisticated children of nature. So this idea of a civilizational difference between the complex inner life of a European and the simpler life of an Indian first makes its appearance. However, 3 Indians were trained in mesmerism. He is respectful of the local traditions, shares a session with the local magician who's famous for curing hysteria. And he points out the similarity with Indian healing traditions and therefore challenges the moral superiority and the moral authority of the colonial establishment. He's also subjected to inquiry by medical doctors, but Lord Dalhousie is a great supporter, and he's the de facto ruler of British India, and therefore he keeps going ahead with mesmerism. Soon after that, we find the first appearance of the word hysteria by an Indian doctor. Now, Pandurang is a doctor. I don't know where he has studied, but he is obviously of Indian origin. Medical schools have been in existence in India from 1835, and he's reporting a case on hysteria in sometime in 1869. And it's a young girl around 20 years old who has developed these symptoms, unremitting hiccups, pupils are dilated, and all this was started at about 8:30 a.m. when she was engaged in keeping a cow dung in her hut and saw a snake slither away. Now, this he diagnosed as hysteria, and he calls it as its reappearance and appears to be related to more of a mental peculiarity of the patient, similar to hysteria, rather than to a true morbid condition or a disease condition of the corpus striatum, which more generally happens to be the cause. In this small line, you become aware that he's aware of Bricade's putting hysteria as a brain disorder, but he does not agree with it. He does not see hysteria purely as a brain disorder, but he's familiar with the context. He does not see it as a sexual issue, unlike Charcot, because the girl is only 12 years old, or as later, like Freud, consider the possibility of the snake symbolizing repressed sexuality or childhood exposure to inappropriate sexual symbolism. So even by 1869, Indian doctors are internalizing the concept of hysteria as it is occurring in the Indian context. Murray in 1885 makes a point to describe hysteroepilepsy in a German male sailor who also had genuine seizures and later develops insanity. So within India itself, there's a lot of debate about female and male hysteria. This is extended by the end of the 19th century, when people start using hypnotism, and by Delaney, for example, uses hypnotism for hysterical blindness and deafness. A patient will become blind and deaf in one eye and one ear, which is neurologically impossible. Opium addiction, he also treats people with opium addiction. And in this particular case, he speaks to the patient through an interpreter. So Delaney himself speaks only English and Urdu, and he talks in Urdu to a company soldier who then translates from Urdu to Pashto. The soldier is of Afghan origin. So you see here that people are trying to communicate ideas about their mind across languages. And this becomes an important part of what we think of as psychotherapy and mesmerism and how it's applied. However, he also says this Hindu Bania who has chronic gastralgia, treated him with hypnotism and gave him a piece of paper with some scribbles, which the patient was asked to apply to the abdomen with a pen record. So some kind of faith healing was occurring. Chetan Shah, who we met a few slides ago, also comments that there is a big deal to be learned from the older Unani Hikmat or the Greek system, which had been prevalent till then. And although the European system is superior, a lot has been lost in the country by this Western medicine. And he makes an earnest request that although it may be very silly in one's perspective, in its total perspective, but we should not throw off the roses because they're surrounded by thorns, and we can pick out and learn a few good things, even from savages. This is written in Peshawar, and it obviously has huge symbolism even now. However, in the public life, it is a very different issue. There are epidemics of demoniacal possession. In 1889, this occurs mainly in women who are prone to fasting, having visions and having convulsions, and also occurs in self-deceived mediums who are talking to atmas and the souls of dead people. The treatment the writer feels requires control over the emotions and direct these into fresh channels. This way back in 1889. These ideas persist for very, very long. 100 years later, at Nimans, 3 of my colleagues find that there are 200 people thought to be possessed by sorcerers in an epidemic of demonic possession in Mysore state in Karnataka. And these are people across several Hindu and Muslim shrines all over interior Karnataka. And but 40% of them were diagnosed to have hysteria, 73% somatization, and full half of them with schizophrenia. Now, how these ideas intermix, therefore, is quite obvious. Interestingly, the article was commented upon by practitioners in the UK who saw this as a religious problem. In the predominantly Hindu culture of India is the Bhanamati psychosis, although the authors make it a point that the patients were both Hindu and Muslim and the shrines were both Hindu and Muslim. They see it as a Muslim Bangladeshi pattern, which occurs in London when people have demonic possessions, but similar patterns exist in Hindu Bengal. So the fact that similar patterns occur in both these religious traditions becomes a matter of curiosity for the British. So by the end of the Victorian period of 1889-1900, these ideas about the control of female sexuality, of the fact that hysteria and the wandering uterus can give rise to problems, has become a part of popular culture. This young woman in a slight state of disability is seen, and all these young women on the side are seen as victims of this kind of process. And these kinds of braces and these kinds of spinal massages are the results of incorrect posture. These are supposed to keep the uterus in place and avoid any other kinds of female weakness, backache, stomach trouble, constipation, nervousness, headache, etc., etc. So this kind of a very physical treatment to what is initially thought of as a metaphorical disorder caused by unfulfilled uterus as a metaphorical state is now changed into a very physical restriction of the female genitalia. In India, of course, also these ideas come in, and this is a Ayurvedic compendium from Kerala in the 1890s, where pills are being given Abla Sanjeevani, the nectar for female diseases like hysteria, etc. So even Ayurvedic traditions are quick to absorb the idea of hysteria and the notion of the uterus being a source of this disease into their own systems, and then claim some kind of parallel existence with the allopathic systems, with the modern medical systems. So within the 19th century, we find that in the middle of the 19th century, native doctors are understanding what hysteria is. They know they are questioning the theoretical basis of the prevailing ideas and the use of faith. For example, Chetan Shah treats a patient with hysteria merely by asking them to recite certain passages from the Guru Granth Sahib. The patient is a Sikh girl. So giving them some ideas about the appropriate modes of behavior as described in the Guru Granth Sahib serve as adequate treatment. By the end of the 19th century, however, the treatment of hysteria will include being pinched, pricked, burnt to the match, employed a battery with electric shock, ether, pilocarpine, caffeine, carbolic acid, all with no improvement. Because by this time, it was also felt that much of this was malingering or willed behavior. And in any case, Indians are saturated with superstition, imaginative, and credulous, especially under the influence of a Sahib. And therefore, their psychology is not evolved enough to think about therapy, but they need to be treated with physical interventions like all these pinching and acid treatments. To give you a slight digression as to how these ideas about female sexuality and all these things did change over this period. This is a famous case of Lola Bontes, who's an Irish-British dancer. Her universe is from Simla to California to Australia, and she gets banned several times from doing the notorious spider dance. And she's the mistress of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, who almost loses his kingdom because of his infatuation with her, and is also the mistress of Liszt. She's quite a famous person in the early 19th century. But the song has been taught to her by a housemaid in India. And this, fake spiders swim among her skirts and how she removes layers of skirts to get rid of the spiders is the basis of this famous song in the so-called modern Indian movie of Madhumati, the Kaise Rakate Bichwa. Now, is Kaise Rakate Bichwa is an Indian song or an Irish song or Irish to India song or Ireland to India back to India through Australia and America? We don't know. The point is that these European, Victorian, and South Asian sensibilities of the status and the nature of women in society and control of their sexuality get all mixed up. So we get large number of admission in mental hospitals for hysteria, for nymphomania, although there are no accounts given as to on what grounds are people being called these kinds of disorder. Therefore, ideas of hysteria found fertile imagination in the Indian popular culture. This is the time that Freud comes in, and he makes his classical textbook on the studies of hysteria, Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud. And this has a number, this is a very busy slide, but it'll take some time. So Freud was treating this young lady who was a patient of Breuer, who suddenly embraced Freud and apparently tried to behave in a suggestive manner to Breuer, who then transferred the case to Freud, who then went through a whole lot of interviews and found that certain kinds of sexual events had happened in the past, or what she imagined had happened in the past. And these kinds of sensory stimuli from the peripheral sense organs gave rise to certain kinds of psychic desires, which gave rise to sexual patterns of behavior, and which went on to perpetuate themselves in some kind of a cycle. He transferred this kind of idea of sexuality into a thermodynamic theory of sexuality, by which the free association is subject to experience and hierarchical structures of the brain in terms of the unconscious, the pre-conscious, the unconscious, the ego, and the superego could modify a person's behavior. To do all this, he used a combination of what he called free association and dream analysis. And these were major preoccupations all over the world. For example, this book written in India called The Dream Problem by Ram Narayan in the early 1920s discusses the issues of how dreams are to be analyzed and how they can be used to drive our understanding of the human mind. And if you can see, it has essays by Swami Dayanand, by a who's who of Indian, social life at that time, and a large number of contributors from America, including Morton Prince, one of the first, perhaps the first early modern psychologists in America. So at this time also, there is a lot of exchange of ideas between the nature of dreams, the nature of the unconscious, and how dreams and desires reflect a conscious awareness. They, of course, build upon much older ideas. For example, this account of Tipu Sultan's dreams, because he himself used to record his dreams and try to analyze them. And dream analysis has a very long history in Islamic medicine, because when you sleep, your ruh is supposed to float towards that of God. Whatever happens in your dreams is partly a definition of divinity. So Tipu Sultan's dreams were therefore have been analyzed several times, and you can read about them here. So whether it's dream analysis or sleep analysis or the structural theory of the mind, all these get rapid acceptance in India, at least in certain circles. Of that, the most famous is Girindra Shekhar Bose, who is a medical doctor who trains himself as a psychoanalyst and then starts the Department of Psychology in Calcutta University and founds the Indian Psychoanalytical Institute and starts popularizing the notion of mental causes steeped in the social events of Bengal around the turn of the century. By this time, Bengal has a long tradition of articles which adapt Western teaching into local Bengali. And the ideas of hysteria or women's illnesses are going back and forth in Bengali vernacular and the English. And Girindra Shekhar Bose gets into communication with Freud, discusses about various aspects of Freudian theory, and tries to develop an Indian ethos of at least the kinds of patients he sees. And these techniques are applied to patients in the Calcutta mental hospitals and to the Lumbini Park Clinic, where he's associated with. So these kinds of ideas, it is not called Lumbini Park, then it was the Carmichael Hospital, but he tries to apply psychoanalytical ideas to Indian patients. On the other hand, on the other end of India, you have Major Satyanand, who is a psychiatrist based in Lahore, who tries to understand the same issues of dream interpretation using Indian mythology as a text. And he tries to integrate the myth of Savitri, the myth of Ahalya, the myth of various women figures in Indian psychology, in Indian mythology, into the problems of a young Indian woman who is having problems, not exactly having problems, but she wants to become a freedom fighter. She's middle class, she's rich, she has a car, she goes to parties. And therefore, there's a lot of psychological dissonance in her mind between her real life and her imagined life. So he puts in this whole model of Vigyan, Buddhi, and Manas and Chitta, and how all these ideas can be basically reflect a same structural theory as Freud did. All these have been analyzed in this new book by Sarah Pinto called The Dr. and Mrs. A. And all those of you who are interested are strongly recommended to read this book because it puts into perspective how ideas about power, sexuality, and autonomy reflect in middle 20th century India. The other famous person to work on hysteria is, of course, Berkeley Hill, who is a British psychiatrist posted to the Ranchi Mental Hospital for almost his entire working life in India, except for a brief interspersed in Peshawar and things like that. So he's very psychoanalytically minded. He writes these very interesting articles called The Psychology of the Sari, The Psychology of the Germans, The Psychology of the Anus, and the mental process of the sane and the insane. And he also writes a very interesting article on the psychological issues that divide Hindus and Muslims and how sharing a meal together would probably get rid of most of the communal divide. At the end of it, he is quite an iconoclast and he is not formally trained in psychoanalysis. He's been in India all the time that Freud is in Europe, but he is very enamored by these psychoanalytical ideas. He does try his best to adapt it to India. And one of his students is Satyanand, whom we saw in the previous slide. So these ideas about hysteria become quite prominent in Indo-British psychiatry by the time we get independent. Now, around independence, of course, is decolonization. And that's when the whole debate about the role of what happens to Freudian ideas after Freud is dead. Because as more and more images emerge, as more and more facts emerge, the assault on truth, for example, Jeffrey Masson goes to the actual case notes and finds that what Freud said were imagined sexual encounters by these women when they were young girls were actually true. And Freud had willfully suppressed the actual incidents of child sexual abuse or inappropriate sexual behavior occurring at a prepubertal age, and how the seduction theory was therefore in its essence false. Now, Janet Malcolm found by this time that the psychoanalysis as a profession had become locked in very sterile debates about their own niche areas of what was the structure of the psyche, whether it was object relation, whether it was interpersonal, whether it was post-Freudian, or completely still based on early childhood, or was it a dynamic thing like Lacan and the other French psychoanalysts tried to do. So it became a very difficult field to intellectually come to terms with. Of course, psychoanalysis and feminism pointed out that Freud never allowed his daughter to become a psychiatrist. He resisted her attempts to become a psychoanalyst because he felt that this was beyond the capacity of women in some extent to understand issues like penis envy, etc., etc. And all these other books on top, which Kate Millett, Simone de Beauvoir, Eric Fromm, Herbert Matthews, who were trying to understand the politics and the social context of mid-century, 20th century Europe, had severe criticism of the way psychoanalysis or understanding of hysteria was being talked about. On the other hand, from other places in the world, like Frantz Fanon, Ashish Nandi, and Sudhir Kakar, were pointing out their significant sociological differences in the way the psyche is considered and the influence of the experience of colonization on their own assessments of themselves as men and women, as bodies, as minds, was influenced. And unless one understood that whole experience, one would not be able to understand the sense of self. For example, but despite all this, histrionic personality disorder continues to persist. The word hysteria itself was eliminated from psychiatric diagnosis about 30 years ago, and it no longer exists. Now, why is it important to us, even in the here and now? Now, for example, as of this morning, 107 witch hunt deaths in 8 years. Now, witch hunts were done in the 17th century Europe and in America in the 18th century, basically identifying hysterical women. They had symptoms to pick up hysterical women, and these were basically widows, elderly, or vampish women who were then pulled out, but basically without a man in the background, and they were pulled out even then. And they were supposed to have unnatural powers of seduction, and they were tied to the stake and burned then, and they continue to be done so now. The slides on top, these two refer to this epidemic about 10 years ago, about somebody called a monkey man who went around Delhi lopping off locks of hair from people at night. And this became a cause célèbre. It was a kind of covered on TV, discussed in media, discussed in journals, and it turns out it was just epidemic hysteria. There is no monkey man. Nobody's hair was being cut. It was a self-delusional belief. So why do these epidemics of hysteria? Why is it that the need for miracles continues to persist in our society? It becomes another question, becomes the same question 200 or 300 years later. This is not unique to India. For example, all over from approximately the Suez Canal to Korea, there's a peculiar preoccupation with that loss of semen somehow devitalizes people. And preoccupation with penis shrinking and getting smaller becomes a mass belief system. In 1967, the whole state of Singapore almost went into riots because people felt that their penis was being shrunk and stolen. West Bengal and Northeast India have recurrent patterns of this Kuru epidemics. One was only a few years ago. The fifth Kuru epidemic in India of 2018. So these ideas that somehow men's gender is being interfered with by the mass, by people who can do these things, and somehow Indian males or South Asian males are being robbed of their virility, becomes a very important, almost not just a clinical, but also political question. Now, why should women's sexuality be seen as a medical problem, but men's sexuality as a political problem becomes an issue as to how we view sexuality in terms of social context and why hysteria becomes different in men and women. Now, this is best exemplified by a disease called Kuru. Now, Kuru is a very rare disorder, over 3,000 or 4,000 people all over the world till now. It was first identified in Papua New Guinea about in the middle of the century, and generations of anthropological researchers, at least for 20 years, looked at it as a belief in sorcery, as some kind of a culture-bound syndrome by which people would not walk, and ultimately, because they did not walk, their legs would atrophy, and they would die. Now, this was a mass hysteria with severe consequences. However, by the middle of the century, a person called Carlton Gajdusek, who established a very complex web of relationships with the Foray community in Papua New Guinea, and then exploded by using not just anthropological measures, but also genetics and viral genomics, and found out that this was actually a retroviral genome, a retrovirus, which was entering the bodies of the others because of the practice of cannibalism, and therefore affecting their brain, and therefore causing the neurological symptoms. Got him a Nobel Prize. And the whole idea of how prions exist and how prions are transmitted and how we understand modern concept of disease arose from this idea that this was sorcery and some kind of anthropological museum piece in a primitive culture. So the idea of primitiveness and sorcery gave rise to this idea that this could not possibly be a medical disease. Of course, the fact that it occurred in cannibalistic societies further accentuated the primitiveness. But only later did we realize that this is the same as mad cow disease and scrapie, and occurs in all populations of the world who are not theoretically as primitive. So how the notions of hysteria guided this whole concept becomes important for us to understand in sociological and other terms. What has also happened over the recent past is that because hysteria is seen as a psychological distress, in many other places in the world where you have to pay for medical tests, this is seen as malingering, and psychological diseases are not covered by insurance in America or Europe. So people have had to discover non-epileptiform seizures, which is basically the same as what Briquet and Charcot were talking about 200 years ago, and why we shouldn't need to reinvent the wheel. Now, however, they find that in those with so-called psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, fits, the mortality rate is 2.5 times that of the general population, with suicide and others being the majority. So even though they may be having fits, they probably have some other underlying emotional problems, which makes them 3 times more likely to commit suicide. Same thing goes for faints with psychogenic non-syncopal collapse, which is otherwise called fainting. They have very high rates for depression, anxiety, and suicidal attempts. Long-term follow-up of these fainting attacks, PPS is a serious condition. And now, because we have more toys to play with, remember Briquet pointed out that unfortunate events affect parts of the brain that are involved in affective processing, and that's how they call neurological disease. But now we can see that with an MRI scan. We find that that is exactly what happens, that areas involved in memory processing, motor activity, and attention control, these become linked in a very dynamic manner once trauma occurs, and there's an interaction between these areas, which gives rise to what the neurologists call non-epileptic seizures and what psychiatrists call hysteria. But the distinction between the two is purely on the specialists. So neurologists and psychiatrists give the same thing different names because they have different economic pressures. I'll quickly run through some case veneers. These are all published, so it's not a problem. So one more, we have these 5 women on the table, all had childhood sexual abuse. All 2 of them continue to have hysterical symptoms and they became better only when after going under therapy for several years, for 3 to 4 years or a couple of years at a time. This was a middle-aged lady who was treated as a somatoform disorder despite the absence of any stressor. She was 50 years old, had already had 2 children. So her uterus was not unfulfilled in any sense of the term. But the doctors in Bengal felt that since the uterus was the seat of hysteria, they actually did a hysterectomy. They removed the uterus. This was in 2020. So the idea of the uterus being to blame for emotional problems in women continues to be alive and kicking in India even in 2020, which is quite a worrisome idea. These are more clear-cut, a 25-year-old woman who's possessed by the ghost of the first wife, who has been fertile, and she herself has had 2 abortions. So this kind of wish-fulfilling aspect of the hysterical symptom becomes quite evident. And as is the last one of marginalized road repair worker, very poor support by the male figures around her. She is unable to get children to school as she has no fixed address, but then she becomes a goddess and all help becomes available. So many times, as Mesmer had pointed out, it is the social inequality which forces people to use this kind of, even if your status is not equal in class or in richness, there's an equality that Mesmerism allows. There's an equality which this kind of symptoms of hysteria allow. That the role of a sick person, getting on the role of a goddess, getting on the role of a dead member of the family, while in that influence, you can abuse family members, you can scold your mother-in-law, you can do all kinds of things. So these kinds of symbolic expressions do act as emotional pressure release. And therefore, the occurrence of hysteria becomes, in that sense, commonsensically available. This is a more detailed case, which I requested one of my colleagues, Dr. Madhuprida, to talk about if she is here. But this again shows that this was a Muslim girl who was seen by a Hindu therapist. One has to work through different notions of what causes madness, about the diamonds and the jinns, and how all these ideas get linked up with sexual abuse, with sexuality, with homoerotic experiences. And ultimately, you do have to work through all these conflicting ideas in a person to help hysteria. Now, so therefore, what is it that we learn? So over the last 400 or 500 years, when religion and feudalism have been replaced by what we think is reason and passion, what has happened to the individual mind? Before 1500 or 1600 AD, the human mind or the human will did not exist. We acted by God's wills or by the dictates of religion. The idea of the individual mind, which bears responsibility for itself, is a very new idea, as is the idea of independence. So if we are going to be thinking of ourselves as independent human beings, then where do we draw the line for independence? What is the tension between reason and emotion that we all apply to our own minds? And therefore, there is a biology, there's a psychology, and a sociology of hysteria. And that we still struggle to provide meaning and explanatory models that are universal or true across cultures and time. Now this becomes an issue because Freudian theory and the was very different. And will someone's truth become someone else's operation? And does the secularized mind exist? Will it, and can we ever use the mind in the same way as we do for the heart and the liver? So hopefully I've been able to tell you that unlike many popular persons of psychiatrists in popular media who insist that the psychiatrist is a problem and you should kill the shrink and psychiatry is a lie, that sometimes we do try to think of things in slightly more complex issues. And And thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Sanjeev. That was a really fascinating talk and like a very good time point for us to start taking questions. So I'm just going to encourage everyone in the audience to add your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll ask Sanjeev to answer some of them. I'm sure there are many questions. And while people start, I just want to also say that a lot of the things that you spoke about, Sanjeev, reflect some of the things that other speakers in our lecture series have also hinted at. For instance, I think you spoke about Girendra Babu and the establishment of the Indian Psychiatric Institution, and I think Shruti Kapila's lecture where she talked about Freud and Nehru and how the sort of words from psychoanalysis have come into our language. I think that would be a very interesting lecture to reference back to. And again, the bit you spoke about in the end as well about Mesmer and the idea of possession. One of the films that we showed, Eyes of Stone by Nilita Bhutani, which is again, and she in her discussion with Purnama Bola from Nimhans, actually they really opened up this in a lot of conversation as to the same thing that you said, and they used this really apt word which was called sankat, where they said that this is one way that it was you were able to speak out, right? And all the things that you said. So I think these are some interesting connections that I made while you were talking. And I think it was great to sort of see how culture and the way psychiatry and hysteria, the concept of hysteria, has evolved sort of hand in hand through history. So I think maybe I will start with a question that are while I wait for the audience to add their questions in the Q&A box. You spoke about the epidemics of hysteria, right? And how that there are still, but you sort of have this mass sort of thing. So is it something that is actually infectious? Is there actually a thing that if someone has it, this actually spreads through a community? Or is it more a question of social psyche, like we behave together in some way as a community or as a group?
See, contagiousness is both a cognitive and a physical process. As your previous exhibition, Contagion, showed, that there are bugs that travel from person to person, but there are also ideas that travel. And the epidemic hysterias have been, for example, in this last epidemic of Kuru, which was 4 or 5 years ago, it was quite amazing because it starts out in Bengal, then starts affecting migrant workers in Bombay, who get worried that they have to go back to Bengal to get the correct treatment for their shrinking penis. It's just not men who are worried. A woman brings her son to the clinic saying that, between morning and now, he's 4 years old, his penis has shrunk. So this idea that something is happening to emasculate the men around gets a kind of a popular perception, and this idea spreads. So this spreads within a culture, within a particular context, and over again these epidemics occur. It also shows that within a social network, there can be a shared set of belief systems which allow this to occur more often. And it is where how that inness and outness is defined, which defines the spread of these ideas. Of course, there are others who believe that, a lot of Western ideas are also actually, infectious, contagious ideas, but that's a separate thing.
Okay, there are now a lot of questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start off with there. So I think the first question, and I mean, maybe you have sort of addressed this in the lecture, is what is the biological basis of hysteria? And I mean, are there any new theories in neuroscience?
No, there are no new theories in neuroscience which can explain the precise occurrence of a hysterical symptom. We are still in that metaphorical space where we believe that the so-called emotional part of the brain, that is the limbic system, the amygdala, somehow gets disconnected from the thinking part of the brain, that's the frontal cortex, either in terms of repressed memories or trauma. And this dissociation itself causes certain patterns of behavior to emerge, which are, in a sense, preordained by learning, culture, etc., etc. But we don't have a precise knowledge as to how the switching occurs. These are theories.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
And people have done this with MRIs and all that, and they've seen that these things happen. But nobody's done an MRI study on a person who's actually undergoing a hysterical symptom in that sense.
Okay. I think the next question from Khyati is connected to the initial discussion on hysteria. She asked was how was these episodes of mass hysteria treated?
They were often not treated. They would die out, they would wither away on their own. And these were typically they would just wither away, they would just disappear, and nobody would ever treat them. These were just anthropological and sociological curiosities, and they were observed, and they continue to be observed in many different ways. But but there's no effort at a medical treatment model.
And there's a really
for the Bhanamati psychosis, however, the psychiatrists involved did go around the villages and try to educate people about superstitiousness. And that seemed to have worked, but Bhanamati psychosis returned last couple of years ago again. So these things have a very short memory. If you remember Dr. Dhaborkar, who was trying to lead a campaign against superstitious and demon possession in Maharashtra, got into a lot of trouble because of his opinions and was shot dead.
Okay. There's an interesting sort of follow-up question, and a similar thought came to my mind is in today's age, does the faster and deeper spread of information due to the internet and the digital world that we live in, can this act as a facilitator or can or even an impediment to mass hysteria?
I don't think so. See, because for that it will go back to the old idea as to how elaborate is the human mind, because the human society has exploded exponentially in the last 300-400 years, not only in numbers but in the number of books published. So increase in population is much less compared to the increase in number of books. Number of printed word in all the languages exceeds the number of individuals on earth. You go to any Google page, you go to National Library, the books are in millions and billions. So information is always going to exceed the physical, corporeal reality of the human body. Information and ideas are going to be much larger because the world of ideas is much larger than that of the human body. How we are going to interact with the two is something that every cycle has its own issues. Whether you restrict information or whether you allow the human society to adapt to this much information and develop its own filters, we don't know. But I don't think there should be much concern about this, except for the fact that the electronic medium, etc., seems to emphasize the so-called emotional, immature part of the brain a bit more. The preoccupation with violence, pornography, sex preoccupies a disproportionately large proportion of the net space. And therefore, we are going back into the 16th century of having a very sexualized notion of human existence. And that will create problems.
Okay. That's really interesting. There's still on this topic itself. I'm just going to continue with the questions which are around this topic. So this is from Meghna, and they ask, so we've heard of various incidents of shared psychosis through media. The Burari deaths, for instance,
yes.
One of them. Is there any specific explanation or reason for this?
Now, that's a very interesting issue, because this is shared delusional disorders and what the French call hysterical psychosis. The French are the only country in the world to have a concept called hysterical psychosis. And so there the idea of control and power becomes very concrete, that there is a controlling mind who is now controlling the minds of the others. And therefore, by purely a process of infection and contagion, the ideas of that person are now filtering down to the others. So it is the most extreme form of hysterical takeover. Typically, this occurs not with other human beings. The hysteria is typically of divine origin or some unnatural origin. But when it starts being attributed to other people around you, it veers closely to black magic, to sorcery, and for which, as a society, we haven't developed checks and balances. So these, the Burari killings and these episodes of more severe mass hysteria. There was this famous, I forget his name, but a pastor, somebody who made 800 of his disciples commit suicide in an island in South America. They were all American. Similar thing happened in Switzerland. Similar things happened with the On Shinyo cults in Japan. So these kinds of very strong ideological positions, which give themselves a position of moral authority, like the colonial enterprise, microstructures of this power inequality drives hysteria to a large extent. Whether it's a young woman trapped in a patriarchal society or in an abusive relationship, or it's an individual trapped in equally disruptive or manipulative power equation with the people around, both get prone to hysteria.
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev. And I think this is a good time for us to close the session so that you have a break before the tutorial. I'd just also like to let participants know that, especially our young adult participants, that we have a tutorial session with Sanjeev where you can continue this conversation and ask Sanjeev for the questions about this talk. So please do attend the tutorial with Sanjeev. And for now, I'd also like to say that if you've missed any of our previous events or you want to listen to this lecture again, do check it out on our YouTube channel. We have recordings of all the previous lectures as well, and it'll be great. You'll be able to dive deeper into some of the things that Sanjeev has spoken about today. If you enjoy the lecture, you can watch the recording of the discussion on Eyes of Stone between filmmaker Nilita Vachani and psychologist Purnima Bola. You could also view the Asylum, the exhibit by Dr. Alok Sarin, Sanjeev, and Dr. Pratima Murthy. So that's, again, you'll get to see a bit more about Owen Berkeley Hill in that exhibit, whom Sanjeev spoke about. Another interesting exhibit that might be of interest is the Mughal Pain Questionnaire by Eugenie Lee, which explores the idea of pain, especially in the context of her own experiences with chronic illness. So do continue to explore the exhibition and look at all the things that we have available. These will all be up only until the 15th of May. Please also do share your feedback with us about this lecture as well as about all the other programs that have been happening. The feedback form link is in the chat. Register for the rest of our programs and visit the exhibition website. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Sanjeev, so much for this really interesting lecture. And yeah, I'll encourage those who have signed up for the tutorial to join Sanjeev back at 8 p.m. to continue the discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. See you in a while.